I am an African.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Africa for Dummies A4D. It's with me, Zenge, as usual. And once again, Nathan can't join us today. We are going to discuss a very, very pertinent issue happening in Malawi, in Mozambique, in southeastern Africa. The floods. We're going to be talking about the floods in Malawi. We have seen, our news screens have been covered. If you're following African current affairs, you definitely know that there's massive floods going on in Malawi, and Mozambique is no stranger to floods. So we're going to unpack this story. We're going to talk about the context. We're going to talk about climate change as a whole and how it's affecting Africa with a very, very special guest. Her name is Alexina Phiri. She is a lawyer, has over 7 years of experience in implementing policies tackling critical global issues such as human rights, governance, and counterterrorism. She's also a British diplomat in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So for those that don't know what that is, that's basically the foreign ministry. She's played a key role in organizing international summits such as the Africa Investment Summit in 2019, COP26, the big climate conferences that happen every other year. She's also former acting British High Commissioner to Zambia in 2019, acting Deputy British High Commissioner to Botswana in 2020. And Alexina Phiri is also working with the Trade and International Trade Department of the UK in Asia. So welcome to the Africa for Dummies team, and we're happy to have you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really, really happy to be here. Firstly, I just want to say thank you for having me on this podcast. I've listened to some of them and I think it's absolutely brilliant what you're doing, simplifying the language. So I hope I'll be able to add to the great work that you're already doing on that. As you know, I am Malawian born, so this issue is very close and personal to me. So I just want to thank you and your team for spreading awareness on what's happening in Malawi, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the draws also was that you're originally from Malawi, and we wanted to have someone that was able to speak about this because you most likely know someone that is probably affected by these floods, by the Cyclone Freddy. So the cyclones go Cyclone Freddy. I don't know how the naming goes, but I know the
I
previous
don't
ones had different names. I don't know if it's only male names, but anyway, just to give us a bit of context about these events in Southeastern Africa. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, the cyclone first hit Mozambique and caused a lot of damage. For those who don't know on this podcast, what a cyclone is, it's a type of storm that can bring strong winds and heavy rain. It causes a lot of flooding and different kinds of damages. And fortunately for this cyclone, it just didn't stay in Mozambique. It also moved over to Malawi. Malawi is one of the neighboring countries of Mozambique and has caused a lot of problems there too. And I think it's been called one of the longest cyclones of all times. I don't know if that's
Mm,
correct. You
yeah.
can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I think
But
that's yeah, 35 days or something like that. Yeah.
yes, which is unusual for a cyclone. And it's caused a lot of flooding, landslides. So a lot of people's homes and farms have been destroyed. And like I mentioned before, some of my family has been affected,
Wow.
losing some of their um, homes and which are closer to the areas that have been affected.
Mm.
And it's really, really devastating to say the very least. And seeing the news and following the situation, most people don't have access to food, don't have access to clean water and medical care.
Mm.
And what I can see is the people in Mozambique and Malawi, they're doing their best to really try to deal with this situation. And I've been really impressed with how the community in Malawi, people around the world have really supported Malawians to rebuild their homes and lives because you can't prepare for this sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, the toll in Malawi, from what I have read so far and what I have seen, is particularly devastating. As of 2015, sorry, as of the 15th of March, 2023, over 400 people have died. And the president of Malawi, Lazarus Chakwera, appealed for aid. And as you said, not everyone, Malawians weren't particularly expecting this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
No one wasn't necessarily planning for a cyclone. I mean, I understand this is cyclone. This is a cyclone season, I think. But
Yeah, yeah.
how prepared really was Malawi for these floods?
Okay, like you mentioned, the president has appealed for aid to help the country with the aftermath of the cyclones. Malawi is not a country that's not used to dealing with floods, same as Mozambique, you know. They occur frequently, especially during the rainy seasons. But I think in terms of Cyclone Freddy, it really exceeded the country's preparedness measures.
Yeah.
And it was difficult for a small country like Malawi really to deal with the magnitude of this event. And, what I've always tried to move away from is really the blame game. The UK itself, when
Mm.
we have massive snow, I get a lot of cancellations. My train is cancelled. They do
Yeah.
impact on people's lives. And like every natural disaster, it can be unpredictable. And
Mm.
even though you can try your best to be prepared, it can still be a struggle. And we've seen that as well in developed countries as well as in development countries. And I think this is one of those unprecedented events that Malawi was faced with, to be honest with you. And I think what's important for us it really is to learn from these experiences, especially with climate change, to start taking steps to improve how we can better be prepared for future disasters. I mean, the case of Malawi, it's really clear
Yeah.
that more work needs to be done to be prepared for disasters such as this. And I think the support and help from the international community is going to also be important to help countries like Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar to really start to recover and rebuild and take steps to improve this.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, there was some stuff we put out on our stories on our Instagram for those that follow our Instagram page. The Zambian government donated humanitarian resources worth about 700 and something thousand US dollars, so close to a million.
Mm.
Tanzania about $1 million US also, and obviously like helicopters and things of that nature. And I think the UK has also donated quite a significant amount to the floods in Malawi. So as you said, it's a seasonal thing, and one can't necessarily say Malawians do not. The floods have never happened or cyclones have never happened in Malawi. It's a regional seasonal thing. Indeed, if we can see, in the recent past, Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe lost 1,593 people to Cyclone Idai in 2017, leaving damages
Hmm.
worth about 3.3 billion US dollars. And in 2019, Cyclone Kenneth killed 57 people with an economic damage of Mozambique, particularly worth 345 million US dollars. So, you know, as these are obviously developing countries, um, what in terms of you being in the humanitarian aid
Hmm.
business and also in the foreign office, what help is there like in a tangible basis? What stuff do people actually need? What help? What's being done effectively
Yeah.
to help them? If you get what I mean.
Oh, yeah, no, I get what you mean, and I think that's a very good question. Um, During Cyclone Idai, in 2017, I was actually working as the policy officer for Mozambique at the time. So I really saw firsthand the impacts of the cyclone. And the economic damage, as you mentioned, was really extreme. And to be honest with you, I think it stretched beyond that. And the same as well with Cyclone
Mm.
Kenneth in 2019. I also worked on that. And honestly, I think the devastating impacts were probably way beyond what is estimated.
Wow.
I think, yeah, it's really important for us to really remember that these countries are still developing.
Mm.
And it means that they don't usually have the resources or infrastructure to deal with disasters on this scale. And that's why I think having a international community, and especially these communities coming together to help these countries during these disasters, is very, very important. I'd like to take the time to also recognize organizations such as, United Nations, the
Mm.
Red Cross, Plan International, and a lot of local organizations that are doing great work in terms of providing shelter, food, and medical assistance to people who are affected by the cyclones. And this sort of support cannot be underestimated in helping people, you know? Of course, it's not, sometimes cannot be deemed to be long term, but this short term, immediate actions really go a long way to not prolonging the country suffering or people suffering.
Yeah.
And also, I think, like, when I worked in my role as policy officer on this, I saw governments making pledges, so financial assistance that they will help these countries to rebuild and to recover. And this funding included stuff, on infrastructure projects, repairing roads, bridges, and for programs that can really provide long-term support for those who are affected in these communities. Because don't forget, it doesn't end there. Some of them also lose family members.
Mm.
They're dealing with different issues because of these cyclones. So looking at the long-term impacts is very, very important. And to me, it's clear that a lot of work has to be done
Mm.
to get developing country to a place where the impacts of cyclones or any natural disaster will not be as bad. So I think what we can all do is through donations, like right now, what's going on in Malawi, Mozambique. I've seen a lot of people take action, starting their own just giving pages, starting, doing the best they can to help,
Crowdfunding.
volunteering, yeah, GoFunding, and also I think simply just spreading awareness. We're living in a world that is digitally connected,
Yeah.
and sometimes people don't know what's happening in a place where they don't live at. If
Yeah.
an issue doesn't impact you, sometimes you don't fully get invested or involved. So I think the more people spread awareness on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever platform you're most active on, really also helps because you don't know who can help
Yeah.
and support people. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's true because Malawi always, I guess it seems distant to a lot of people, and people easily just scroll over and continue. And I think that the just a comment. I think the sad thing is, when the death toll is not ridiculously high in some of our parts of the world, it's very easy to ignore. I think
Yeah.
when you saw the earthquakes in Turkey, people have already moved on from the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. But this is 45,000 people. I think it's probably more than that now,
Yeah.
completely dead. And it's very easy for people to move on when, obviously Malawi doesn't control the media waves. So it can't force its agenda on the table. People have to, as you said, individually spread the word. And
Yeah.
I think it's important for many people who are concerned, many people who care about these things, to spread the word around for Malawi. And also, it's a good thing to see
Yeah.
people local. I think the emphasis is always external help. A big UN or
Hmm.
so on. It's good to see that there's also local organizations that are actually active in Malawi, helping themselves as well. And I think that's probably a good way. This is something that should probably be strengthened in the way forward in preparedness for something else, because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, I've always got like this. I always argue with our co-host about this sort of self-reliance. Like, okay, fine, you can get assistance, but make sure that your people are ready, like, they're not waiting. And I think it's a good sign that there's a lot of local agencies that are active on the ground in Malawi.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that talk about the big figures, the stats and uh, the geography of the cyclone, but the human cost, the direct human cost, is something that I'm particularly interested in. So I just wanted to
Mm.
sort of talk about this story in Cyclone Idai, the devastating cyclone in Mozambique, Malawi, and eastern Zimbabwe. In 2017 March, a woman called Amila spent 4 days, yeah, holding on to a tree and gave birth to a baby on that tree. And I think
Wow.
there's footage of it everywhere. It's one of the, I think it was probably an award-winning picture. Obviously,
Yeah.
the idea is not about that it was an award-winning picture, but it was a very
Hmm.
compelling image of
Yeah.
the human cost of cyclones and climate change as a whole. And she was eventually rescued by an aid agency helicopter, Plan International. And this is just an extreme case of
Yeah.
displacement, of what individual
Yeah.
people are going through, their individual stories. I think the baby lives in America now. I think he's got a decent life now. Um, but this is something
Mm.
that he or she, I'm not sure what the sex is, but he or she will always be known for. So do you have any stories of how, the most vulnerable people, particularly women and children, are
Mm.
coping in this situation?
Yeah. Honestly, this story was so inspiring, and it really reminded me the resilience of women and what would really do to protect
Mm,
protect our families. And of course, when I found out I was doing this interview, I went on to research other stories on how women do cope in this sort of situation. So I'll just share some of those if you don't mind.
sure.
One I found that was quite interesting. It was after the cyclone in 2019, a young mother named Martha from Mozambique found herself stranded on a roof with two young children with no food, water, or medical supplies. And she really had to be creative and find
Wow.
her own resources to keep her family alive. From
Mm,
what I read, she created a makeshift shelter from tree branches and leaves and used rainwater to keep her children hydrated. And as well, similarly to the story we were just talking about before, she was rescued by aid workers
yeah.
and yeah, and was reunited with her husband. And then also I found another story which was also, you know, similar. It's always seen in women with children, women of children.
Yeah.
In this example, it's in Zimbabwe,
Okay.
and this woman named Angela was heavily pregnant at the time and was forced to evacuate her home due to flooding. And she had to walk through deep waters to reach safety. And despite literally everything she had gone through,
Mm.
she managed to give birth to a healthy baby boy just a few days later. And I was like, wow, like
Huh.
these
Yeah.
stories are
Yeah.
incredibly
Yeah, isn't it that
inspiring.
song?
Yeah.
I guess uh it's a nod to that song, as a Strength of a Woman. Is it by Shaggy? Forgot.
Oh,
I
I
think it was
don't know
by
that
Shaggy.
song.
Yeah, yeah, it's a big song. It used to be ages ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's actually quite fascinating. The I think you said that the resilience of these individuals,
Yeah.
is absolutely nothing there, and
Yeah.
all the forces are basically against them. And I think perhaps it's probably the necessity to survive, the mother instinct with the child, or a pregnant mother. There's that, probably the instinct to survive. I mean, obviously, I'm not I'm not a woman, nor am I have I got children.
Hmm.
But I can imagine when, like, when you basically have um, a child, and everything else is not in your favor. Some type of necessity or instinct to survive is just forces you to be creative, as you said. Who even thinks of getting
Yeah.
leaves and branches and starts hydrating her children
I
with
know.
water? I mean, it's already probably dirty water anyway, but I don't think she's thinking about this. She's just thinking, okay, as long as my child survives, and we'll be fine. And I think these stories are incredible. These stories are absolutely incredible. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and I wanted to talk about we talked about displacement and sort of the dire
Hmm.
constraints and the really um, interesting and inspiring stories that we hear from these people. There's also the sort of the after effects of these cyclones, of these hurricanes, and when we look at sort of climate change, as you said before, the remnants are not just the economic damage. It's also, people have lost loved ones. But additionally,
Mm,
there's also things like unemployment. When there's damage of property, uh, there's also damage of the infrastructure in which perhaps, say, if you owned a butchery, right? And then a cyclone comes and your butchery is gone. It causes unemployment, I would imagine. And on the scale of these cyclones, it causes mass unemployment. Um, so it results in various grievances, making fertile ground for terrorism. For those that don't remember, northern Mozambique, northeastern Mozambique particularly, was under a very heavy terrorist insurgency, terrorists linked to the Islamic State in Cabo Delgado, which also happens to be the poorest province in Mozambique. So
mm,
you can make some sort of connection, and you have done work on terrorism as well with the UK government. Uh, there is what's your opinion on that in terms of that connection between the effects of climate change and the security problems that arise out of it? Yeah, just
yeah,
an opinion.
I'll be honest with you. Climate change is already a very complex issue, and it really does have that far-reaching impact. And one of those, as you've mentioned, is on global security. And security can be affected and is worsened really by existing social and economic problems, sorry, the climate change. And for example, in Mozambique, what we really did see was that the climate change, cyclones, and all these issues were going on led to mass employment and food insecurity, which really created the perfect environment for groups of extremist views to recruit vulnerable young people. And to be honest, to really address this sort of security issue, we also have to look at the root of the problem, what's going on in that country.
Mm,
Like we're talking about unemployment, etc.
mm,
And climate change somehow it has to be a priority for addressing all these interlinked issues, which also cause and threaten global security. I mean, if we have to invest in renewable energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and supporting communities that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, we might actually be able to mitigate those security risks that are associated with climate change at
mm.
the same time. And like I mentioned earlier, I think it's completely complex,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
there's no one solution to addressing it.
yeah.
It really requires a coordinated, collaborative approach that takes into account the unique needs and challenges of different communities around the world. I mean, I think during the time when the insurgency in Cabo Delgado was at its peakest, there was a discovery of the oil and gas, and there were a
Yeah,
lot of people there. Yes. So that sort of situation definitely worsened the security um, in Mozambique. And also, like once again, as you've seen me talking a lot about this, it's not that I'm just passionate about women and children, but in this situation, again, women and children are the ones that are impacted. So I thought it's really important that the international community works together and stays committed to finding solutions
mm,
that can help build a safer and more secure world for everyone, really,
yeah,
especially women and children included. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know if I completely answered your question, but yeah.
No, 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 no. That was an excellent answer. Yeah, as you said, it's a very complex thing, and in the African setting, I'm sure this could apply to Malawi. But when you look at the informal economies, which for those that don't know, an informal economy is essentially that economy that is not taxed, which is quite predominant in most African countries. So people that sell in markets and so on. So the women normally are the main marketeers and so on. And so when it's impacting them particularly, it's sort of like impacting the breadbasket of the country. So
Mm,
economically, I think that's when it's hitting them the most, it's also hitting the country the most. And in most cases, there's more the female to male ratio is more females than males. So when you have a situation where they hit the women, they're also hitting the informal economy. And so just simply food supply, just basic stuff like that, the marketeers, that already becomes a problem. So we can see, as you said, it's a very complex issue. Everything sort of fits in to this climate change crisis, if you like.
Yeah.
And so obviously you have been involved in setting up the COP26 summit. And obviously you've been involved in the discussing and helping out with the floods in Malawi. There's a feeling that the developing countries are adversely affected. Not a feeling, actually, scientifically proven.
Yeah.
Adversely affected. Sorry, COVID skeptics. It's scientifically proven. Is adversely affected by greenhouse gas emissions. So, in short, climate change, compared to the developed countries. So, the rich countries, essentially, the rich countries, whilst they're producing the most amount of CO2 emissions and are contributing massive chunks into climate change, developing countries are the ones that are affected the most. In Kenya, I think there was a massive drought a few months ago. In Southern Africa as a whole, there was a El Nino effect, where basically there was a shortage of water. So many countries that are dependent on hydroelectricity, like Zambia, Zimbabwe, even Mozambique as well, ended up having power cuts because of the low water levels in their hydropower dams. And now we can see Malawi has also been affected by this extraordinary type of cyclone. And so what can you tell us about these, the differences, the why exactly are small states and countries in the global south having to pay the ultimate price when it comes to climate change, whereas larger states aren't? And being in the COP26 organizing field, what do you have to say about climate finance? There's the term climate finance. What does that mean? And yeah, just let us know what we have to know.
Wow, really good question. And again, sorry to repeat this, but it's very complex. It really is complicated. And I completely agree with you that developing countries have historically emitted fewer greenhouse gases than developed countries. And it's also true that these countries are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. Developing countries, they do lack the resources and infrastructure to adapt to the impacts of climate change, such as, the sea levels rising, droughts and floods. This really leaves most people vulnerable to economic and social disruptions. And that's also including food shortages, displacement, and conflict, some of the issues that we've really been discussing. And I think it is really important that developed countries take responsibility for their role in causing climate change and provide support to developing countries to mitigate and to adapt to its effects. I think we spoke about some of my ideas on how this looks like, like it can take many forms, like including financial aid, technology transfer, and capacity building. But really and truly, I really think that it's not just a matter of responsibility.
Yeah.
It's really a matter of what's right. I don't want to seem so human rights lawyer, here I am, but it's also a topic of justice at the end of the day, We know that the impacts of climate change are not distributed equally across the world. And those who contribute least to the problem are the ones who are suffering the most, right?
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense to me that developed countries should be providing support to developing countries to help them address this and to build more of an equitable global community. So like, in short, who really should pay for climate change? It's not really about the numbers. or the technicalities.
Yeah.
I Yes, I believe that it's a question of values, ethics,
Yeah.
and responsibilities.
Yeah.
Developed countries should have a moral obligation to support those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and to take concrete actions to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. And it can only be done if we really do work together. I really hate doing the blame game.
Mm.
I know, and sometimes we should be doing the blame game, but we really need to
Yeah.
pick up more actions in a way to build a sustainable future for all of us.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. Sorry.
yeah, no, I was gonna just say that even though it is affecting more developing countries, it's a worldwide issue.
Mm.
Even in the UK, I don't know if you've noticed this, but something's not right with the weather.
The weather will.
We're in we're in March. I was seeing snow.
No.
I'm seeing rain. I'm seeing sunshine the other day. I mean, the impact is there. It's only in everybody's best interest for us to look ahead and plan ahead, work together,
Mm.
and sort this out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically to figure out a way forward. And I like that
Mm,
it's not just about the blame game. Of course, there's a blame game and so on. And but like I guess in trying to figure out a way forward, you have to sort of realize as you said, the moral responsibility. But obviously, there's a tendency to drive into a blame game. Uh,
yeah.
and it's not an indictment or like on people that want to talk about these things of justice and because obviously I mean there is a feeling many countries like South Africa with their coal, they're like, okay,
Hmm.
you guys developed, you polluted and so on, but now because of climate change and we are the worst affected, why can we also pollute? Why can't we it's not our problem.
Yeah.
Why can't we also develop and allow us to pollute, you know allow us to pollute, to industrialize. But obviously, as you said, it's a moral and sort of justice discussion, because if you want to, you refusing to help countries like this, providing the finance, because the finance is not going to really come from anywhere else, at least in the short term.
Mm,
If you want to help these countries be more sustainable, be greener, in
yeah.
parts, because they're going to develop either way, with
Yeah.
with or without. So if they're going to develop one way, it would be preferable if it's a sustainable one, right? So I mean, I'm thinking of sort of like if all of most African countries develop rapidly in an Asian manner by
Mm,
2050, just imagine the CO2 emissions if none of them are developing sustainably. Um,
yeah.
so either way, they're going to want to develop. So it's how they're going to develop, and there's always going to be that argument of you have allowed, they allowed you to develop without any restraints, but now you guys want to stop us from developing. So it's sort of the development has to be green, and
Yeah.
yeah. So so the complexity of climate change and how everything is interlinked. We've kind of run down through everything from the actual flood in Malawi, from the different stories to the human costs. We have a question that we always ask our guests. What exactly would you like to be asked? And what, if there's any question, you've been on many panels before, if there's any question that you have liked to be asked that you don't really get enough people asking you, or no one really asks you, what is it? What's that one question that you'd like to be asked?
Okay, thank you. And I absolutely love that question. There are a lot of different questions that I like to be asked, but I'll keep this one specific to climate change. I think what I'd like to see is people really trying to find answers for me on how they themselves as individuals can take responsibility to reduce their own carbon footprint and combat climate change. I think when I see individuals taking that step, it shows me they're interested. It gives me hope that it's not just me and everyone else sitting on this panel or the government or this international organization, but it's individuals, young people
Yeah.
wanting to make a difference. So I always find that question really interesting, and I'll answer it different each time.
Mm.
Yeah. So that'll be my question.
So it's about what you can do as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So sort of like the John F. Kennedy speech. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Or ask what
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
ask not what Africa can do for you, or ask what you can do for Africa. And that's a wonderful way to end the episode. And we just want to thank you for being on Africa for Dummies on A4D. So for those that are listening to our podcast for the first time, if you've just joined, please leave a 5-star rating on any of our platforms. We're on multiple platforms. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Google Podcasts, we're on everything. We have our Instagram page. We have a TikTok page as well for those that are interested. And we are obviously with a very special guest who's an experienced lawyer, a diplomat, trade negotiator, Alexina Phiri, from the British Foreign Department. So thank you for listening to us, and we thank you for having you on here, Mrs. Alexina Phiri, or Miss.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am an African.